for joining me today. Today we're going to be talking about the Canaanites. Now that seems pretty straightforward. You know, they're just the bad guys in the beginning, in the middle of the Old Testament, you know, Joshua through Judges and Kings. They were those people that occupied the land of Canaan, which was promised to the Israelites. Then Moses led the Hebrews out of bondage, and Joshua led the Hebrews to conquer the Canaanites and free the land of Canaan for the use of the Hebrew people. However, as you might have guessed, there's really a lot more to it than that. The term Canaanite really just means person that lived in the modern area or land of Canaan. Now, that's a large group of territory that encompasses parts of modern Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. Now, that's a really large picture of land, as you can see right here. And on top of that, the group of people that we often call Canaanites is really just one of the many groups of people that lived in this area. And the Canaanites were never really a nicely structured group into a single kingdom. For the entire period of Exodus and Judges, the Canaanites were groups of different tribes and cities that often had loose connections at best. They didn't leave us any written record of their own. Most of what we know comes from diplomatic letters found in Egypt, the Old Testament, and from archaeological dig sites. What we do know is Israel had a culture that was very similar to Canaanite culture. Even though they disliked each other, they shared similar construction methods, had similar pottery, and even had similar languages, with both being part of the Semitic family, which leads us to a whole lot of confusion. Because, as I mentioned earlier, Canaanite would just kind of mean a person that lived in the land of Canaan, which could possibly include the Hebrews. So how does that make any sense? Because how are they supposed to be the bad guys and the good guys, if they could both just be the same term? Really, there's just a lot of uncertainty about the name Canaan and Canaanites, and whether it refers to a specific Semitic-speaking ethnic group wherever they lived, or if it was just the homeland of this ethnic group, or possibly the region under this ethnic group's control, or possibly some various combination of all three. I personally think, from the evidence I've seen, that it's really just a catch-all term for people who live in the area, without really any formal state around them. Now, this is definitely the case for this term by the Roman period, but I think it was probably the case for this term before that too. Things were not as nice and neat back then as they are now. There are people who would live without a state, nation, or a country, who lived in lands and were just about as powerful as anyone else, and lived lives just like everyone else. Remember, the Canaanites were there before the Jewish and Hebrew people had kings. At this point, the Hebrews, too, were just a wandering group of people. That's how it was for most of the Canaanites' history. Now, culturally, the big differences between the Hebrew people and the Canaanites was religion. Canaanites worshipped a storm god as the head of their pantheon. Baal was often his name. In fact, Baal, B-A''A'-L, shows up in the Old Testament. It's written about 90 times, always negatively. In fact, the word Beelzebub is often associated with him. It's a name that we now come to find as something of a demon or a devil. But first, it came from the word Baal. It means Lord, or Baal, of the flies. It's very likely that it was meant to say that the followers of Baal are vermin. Not a very nice term indeed. Canaanite towns were often just small walled markets where olives, grapes for wines, wheat and barley were sold. These were not large players around, and they did what they could to survive. The city of Hazor became the center of the Canaanite people at the height of the Middle Bronze Age. But shortly after that, the Canaanites began a slow decline, losing power to their more organized neighbors, like the Egyptians, the Hittites, Assyrians, and of course, the Hebrews. The biblical narrative says that the Canaanites came from Noah's grandchild, Canaan, who was the son of Ham, and therefore carried Ham's curse. Now, Ham was supposed to have been cursed because he looked at his father Noah while he was drunk and passed out bare naked. It's a really odd story, and I don't have time to cover it here, but if you can, go ahead and read it for yourselves. It's found in Genesis chapter 9, verses 20 through 27. From that point, we are come to later understand that the Canaanites were one of the 7 nations that were named that needed to be driven out of the land of Canaan by Joshua. But yet, even then, as it was named in these list of nations, it really could just be a catch-all term for people living in the lands who weren't formally part of the other 6 nations that were mentioned. In the New Testament, Canaanites are mentioned 3 times. Twice, it is mentioned in just the retelling of Old Testament stories in Acts. And once, there's a story from Matthew and Mark of a healing of a woman. Matthew calls her a Canaanite, while Mark calls her a Syrophoenician. Now, Syrophoenician is just another way to kind of say mixed race person, someone both from Syria and Phoenician culture. Both of these terms could really mean the same thing about a person, that they're really just from the land of Canaan without any easily definable state. However, it seems that the term Canaanite was really going out of favor in the Roman period, partly because the world was becoming more structured and there was less independent tribes and people. Eventually, Canaanites came to no longer describe a group of people, but instead to describe an idea. Pilgrims coming to America viewed the Native Americans as Canaanites, and the same was true for settlers of South Africa. Anytime that someone explored somewhere and found a land already occupied, they made themselves out to be the Hebrews and those people they were conquering to be Canaanites. It was a way that they could biblically justify their own expansion. In general, we don't know much about the people that we first described as Canaanites. But for some reason, Canaanites have made their way into our culture more than the Hittites or Edomites ever have. I hope that you've learned something today, and I hope you tune in next time.